organization like Acorn? A desire to help the poor, or a desire to organize radical change in America? And are Acorn's efforts even good for the poor, or for that matter, for this country?
After 38 years in the community organizing business, Wade Rathke defends his life's work in a new book. It is called Citizen Wealth because, he writes, his goal has been to help the poor find a measure of financial security. Rathke says Acorn took a major step toward that goal 7 years after he launched the organization.
1977, one of the primary accomplishments over the last 30 years for community organizations was the passage of the Community Reinvestment Act. Because of that act, you are no longer allowed to redline communities based on income, based on race, based on sex or creed. If banks were getting all of these deposits from the east end of Little Rock, for example, and making no loans in that community, there was something wrong.
Some of Acorn's critics agree the CRA had a big impact on the country. They claim it led to the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. Stanley Kurtz is one of those critics.
The Community Reinvestment Act required that banks make a lot of loans to people in their immediate vicinity, and that they do so in a fair and unbiased way.
That sounds like a good thing.
It is a good thing, but Acorn abused those rules and regulation.
Abused them, Kurtz says, by making outrageous claims that banks were not writing enough loans to low-income borrowers, whether those borrowers could afford the payments or not.
Banks rolled over because they were under pressure.
That's exactly right. But then we come to the critical second stage. So the banks say, look, we'd like to make even more of these high-risk subprime loans. The Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac won't buy them from us.
Kurtz says in the late 1980s, Acorn's lobbyists began pushing for Fannie and Freddie, which bought and secured mortgages, to lower their lending standards. And Kurtz says it worked. By the end of the Clinton administration, about half of the mortgage giants' portfolios were risky subprime loans to low and moderate income home buyers.
And that really was the big move that helped to begin this whole subprime loan crisis.
But that was back in the 90s. How do you connect that to the financial crisis that we've been going through in 2008 and at least the first part of 2009?
First it was the Community Reinvestment Act, then they pulled in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Then, when the capitalists thought, well, let's make some money at it as long as you're allowing us to do that. So there's a share of blame to go around on everyone, but it never would have gotten to that stage if the original standards for credit were adhered to back in the 90s.
How do you respond to that charge, Wade?
Balderdash. There's no evidence that, somehow we convince these huge multi-gazillion-dollar outfits like Fannie Mae or Freddie to jiggle the books somehow so that more of our low-income people could get in. God, I can almost say I wish. The real truth is under agreements negotiated directly by Acorn and by similar community organizations, you can point to 7 million people who are able to gain home ownership in our communities because of the passage of that act.
No doubt some people were helped, but a lot of people got mortgages they couldn't really afford. In the end, their homes were foreclosed. So how is that helping people?
Acorn targeted more than banks and lenders. Beginning in the late 1990s, Rathke says, Acorn began to push for so-called living wage laws that are now in effect in more than 100 cities nationwide. These laws require employers to pay higher than the minimum wage for low-level jobs. Many economists say these laws actually hurt the poor because employers tend to eliminate those jobs instead of paying above market rates. Rathke says he doesn't believe that. But that didn't stop Acorn from making exactly that argument when it tried to convince a California court to exempt Acorn from paying the minimum wage. The more that Acorn must pay each individual outreach worker, Acorn argued in a legal brief, the fewer outreach workers it will be able to hire.
Is that hypocritical?
In retrospect, I wish I'd been a little bit more on top of that issue and sort of, hey, what are you really doing out there? Because we absolutely support the minimum wage and a living wage.
It is not the only time Acorn's been accused of hypocrisy. It is staunchly pro-union, but in 2003, when Acorn workers in Dallas tried to unionize, Acorn got slapped by the National Labor Relations Board for improper anti-union tactics. And while Acorn pressured banks to make subprime loans when real estate shot up in the 90s, when the bubble burst, Acorn began filing lawsuits and staging protests over what it called predatory lending. Acorn tactics have also been criticized. Fox News obtained this cell phone video from March 2005, when Acorn bussed more than 100 protesters to the Virginia Beach headquarters of Liberty Tax Service.
Out of these buses, all of these people come running towards the building.
John Hewitt is Liberty's founder and CEO.
They ran around the building, they were yelling and screaming.
Acorn's beef? Liberty's refund anticipation loans at interest rates Rathke says were predatory. Police records show the protesters were slapped with over 100 summonses. The charge? Participating in a riot. Rathke admits the demonstration went awry, but he says the result was good. Hewitt confirms that Liberty agreed to explain the loans more clearly and agreed to pay an Acorn affiliate about $50,000 a year for 3 years. Rathke says the money was for community outreach. Hewitt sees it another way.
To me, it's just to stop them from harassing us. Even though I felt dirty by paying them money, I said, you know, it's a business decision.
Rathke says 7 months later, a different Acorn target came to a different business decision. That's when Acorn stormed a meeting of the National Paint and Coatings Association in Cleveland.
That's actually one of our failure stories, if you will.
We went there with busloads of people, and those people went into a room and really frightened the people at the hotel who were having this convention.
Acorn organizer Marcel Reed was bussed in from Washington, D.C. that day. She says Acorn wanted the paint companies to pay Acorn to remove lead paint from poor communities.
We asked them for a significant amount of money that I had no idea they were asking for until I was in the meeting. I couldn't carry the meeting on because I just thought this was just an outrageous amount of money.
Sources told us Acorn demanded more than $30 billion for the work, but the paint companies refused to pay.
We certainly did everything through the sink at them, but never could get them to negotiate.
Acorn has used similar tactics to silence politicians it doesn't like. For example, Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee was scheduled to deliver a civil rights speech in 1998.
They surrounded not only the outer walls, but then, much to the dismay of the state troopers who were with me, they then mounted the stage.
Huckabee says he had to cut his speech short and leave through the back door.
It was a very tense moment. It was totally unnecessary.
Thank you!
Kurtz says one politician Acorn liked very much, Barack Obama of Illinois, with whom Acorn has a long history.
Barack Obama worked with Acorn on the ground back when he was a wet behind the ears community organizer in Chicago in the mid-1980s, and then again several years later in 1992 when he headed an organization called Project Vote in Chicago.
Mr. Obama reportedly helped train Acorn organizers and represented Acorn in a voter registration lawsuit. The future president served on the board of a charitable foundation that funded Acorn to the tune of $190,000. And according to then-candidate Obama's blog, he told an Acorn audience in November 2007, "I've been fighting alongside Acorn on issues you care about my entire career." Still, the president now downplays his relationship with Acorn, suggesting the voter lawsuit was his main connection.
Do you know President Obama?
No,